The role of the journalist is, it's interesting to think of. You got sort of three roles, maybe more. And these are not necessarily exhaustive. These aren't necessarily all the things. And I put this together over a weekend. So, if you think there's something missing, please feel free to, say, I think you should add this or that. So looking first at the role. So the first role is to report the news, right? Pretty straightforward. This is like if you ever worked in or read about the food service business. And do people tip waiters here in the Ukraine? Do you leave a gratuity for waiters at restaurants? Yes? Yeah, because in some countries you don't, In the U.S. you do, and people always want to figure out how much do you tip, The rule of thumb in the U.S. is 15% for excellent service. But when you start taking that apart, so what are you paying the waiter for, right? Well, the first thing you're paying the waiter for is to actually bring the food to the table, right? Apart from anything he or she says or does, what kind of style they have, whether they help you make up your mind. Reporting the news is sort of like that. I mean, that's the basic role of the journalist, right? You get the facts right. That's what's expected, and it's sort of like the waiter bringing the food to the table. If they don't do that, there's nothing to talk about, right? You can't critique the meal, if you haven't eaten it, right? So, and of course, those four words, get the facts right, there's a huge, body of activity that goes into that. All the things we were talking about, like fact checking, who does what, calling people back. And, you can't, it's always a function of time, how much time do you have to do things, But apart from the time consideration, I think you can never be too careful about getting your facts right, Make sure you got the spelling of the person's name right, make sure you have the quote right. It's much easier now in a lot of ways than it was when Jackie and I were starting, when there was no internet, When I started at Time Inc. in the 80s, they had a whole floor of the Time Life building in New York, which is a big skyscraper on 6th Avenue. A whole floor of that was the Time Inc. news library. And they had 9 research librarians with advanced degrees who worked there full-time in shifts. So there were people working there at 3 in the morning, for the news magazine. And so it was very luxurious. If you were a reporter, you would call up the news library and say, I want the file on Exxon. And an hour and a half later, a guy would come into your office with a little truck, with all the files on Exxon. And it would have all the clips from the newspapers, cut out with scissors, arranged in reverse date order. And it's one of the things that gave that company a very strong competitive advantage back then, because they were able to have that kind of resource. Smaller magazine would not, But there was no way to get information like that. Now you can, there on most things you can check facts. Of course, not everything. And some of the things that you were talking about before, like the accuracy of data you get, We're going to talk more about data a little in the second session after lunch. So I think I have some questions. I'd like to talk. I want to hear from you about those problems with data here. So I think it's an interesting subject, but we'll postpone that. So in reporting the news, you also get to break news or discover news sometimes. Sometimes it isn't really breaking. Sometimes you discover something that nobody else has written about, and it may be the way you phrase something. And then you also, in many ways, you get to write the first draft of history. Even if you're writing online. If you're writing online for a finance, wire service, when you type the headline, bond rates fell today, That's the first draft of the history someday. Sometimes it's very literal. So I pull out one little example here. This is an article from the Washington Post in 2007 in December about, and it's a company story, like I was telling you about before. Every quarter, companies, report their earnings to the SEC. And this generates news stories. This is a story like that. It starts out as a company story. It's about Morgan Stanley, which is one of the big investment banks, bond underwriters, one of the top 3 or 4 globally, or in the top 3 or 4 in the U.S., one of the top 10 globally for sure. And it was big news. There's their first loss in 72 years, right? I mean, that's one of the critiques of investment banks. They never lose money, right? They make money no matter what happens to everybody. So this is a big deal. And so that's kind of, the lead. And if you read so it's not a long story. It's only, it's like 800 words or something. So at the end of the story, here are the last 2 graphs. And this is journalism. You recognize graph as a word? Paragraph. Or, okay, just to make sure, we say lead, graph, not graph. I don't know. Sometimes I'm not sure everybody calls it the same things. So there are these little details about the Federal Reserve special auction, which was something the Federal Reserve did here. Now, of course, what's going on here is that the credit crisis actually started in August of 2007, although nobody really recognized it at this point. Nobody had said there's a credit crisis. The crisis has started. Like the Fed wasn't sure there was a crisis, much less anybody else. So anyway, at the end of the story, there's this detail about the Fed's auction that day. And then the last graph, the auction results mean that banks were willing to borrow money even without a deep discount. Fed leaders are hoping the auction, combined with another next week, blah, 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 would alleviate banks' unwillingness to lend to one another, which has resulted in higher borrowing costs. That's one of the first things you'll read about the credit crisis. And the guy who, going back, so the byline authors are, Tomeo Murakami Sei and David Cho, but they have a little end report. Cho reported from Washington, so the other guy probably wrote it. And staff writer Neil Irwin contributed to this report. So Neil Irwin, we're going to revisit him. I have, and a little later in this presentation, I'm going to give you profiles of a few young journalists, including him. He just wrote a book about the credit crisis. So this was actually his, he was there. He was very well positioned. He had been appointed the Washington Post Fed reporter in August, right when the credit crisis started, even though he didn't know it was starting. So he had that job like right at the, and he actually made the most of it. It's a good book. So we'll talk about him more a little later, but I'm just saying, when you hear the phrase "the first draft of history," it sounds very grandiose, but it is really true. It's one of the things you get to do. The next one is provide context. And here's where we get into some of the issues that were raised earlier in the general discussion. This and the next one. So, one of your jobs as a journalist isn't just to report the news, it's to provide context about it. Like, what is the historical context? What is the intellectual context? And this relates directly to the discussion we were having about false equivalence, which we're going to get into in a bit. And global context. Something happened here in the Ukraine. Is there something that happened somewhere else in the world that might help understand it? Either, right now or in the past. I'm sure you guys have dealt with questions like that a lot. Like, one of the things that interests me, I don't know that much about the Ukrainian economy, but one of the things that looks interesting about it is, the fact that the currency is tied to the dollar. So it's, what economists call dollarization, which limits what the central bank can do, I think that's probably a pretty interesting subject. And I know, I just know from, writing and editing in the past, there's a lot of history about that. Like Argentina did that in the 80s. Several other countries have done it since, either because they were forced to in crises or because it seemed like a good opportunity. I think providing context is an important part of the role. And closely related to the third one that I wrote down, which is providing interpretation. I probably could have sketched this out some more, but so there's a fine line between context and interpretation. I mean, you can just provide context, and you can you can kind of manipulate, or you can select what you want to present to take people in a certain direction. I mean, in that story, for instance, that hypothetical story we were just discussing, if you had written a story about the dangers of dollar debt, right? I mean, if you look back in the history of other dollarized situations or currencies, and say you found only scary stories, right? Where people have lost a ton of money, right? Then it's easy. You just say, this is a bad idea, right? And you can just present those three, say, here's what's happened in 3 episodes. And that in itself is, in effect, interpreting, because you're leading people to the conclusion that you want to. One of the primary ways you can provide interpretation to is looking at the impact that things have, whether they're market forces or policy changes, the way they affect different constituencies. And I use the term constituencies. It's kind of technical sounding, but it refers to like investors, consumers. It can looking at all those different people. So for instance, when we write about employment in the U.S., one of the sort of classic ways to kind of put more of a human face on it is to use examples, interview people, and use their experiences as a device for telling the story. So like in the U.S., the unemployment data is released every month, like on the 3rd Friday of every month for the month before. So that's the unemployment rate comes out. We're going to talk more about the data like that later today. But knowing that, I mean, the data is going to come out on Friday, right? So you can prepare. You can be all ready to do this story. You know what the press release is going to be like from the government. You know what it will have in it. A ton of stuff in the U.S. employment report. So a classic way that a paper like the Times or the Journal will prepare for the story is you will go out and do some interviews with people that week, or maybe even earlier, and talk to them and, ask them about their experience, and then use that anecdotal information in the story that you write or that you put together after the data come out. So instead of just having a story with a bunch of numbers, that says the unemployment rate, fell by 0.2% last month, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. You can also say, you could talk about like the trends of long-term employment, and then have a passage where you describe a person, who's affected by that, somebody who has been unemployed for a long time. And it can do 2 things. First, it can help the impact of the story, because people reading it then will say, oh, right, this really does affect people. It isn't just a number. And it can also give more context to the numbers themselves. The unemployment rate isn't just, people often just focus on the single number, which is a very narrow definition of unemployment in the U.S. So you can sort of shed more light on what's in that number and what isn't in that number by using some anecdotes about people. So doing that, by using devices like that and reporting like that, you are in fact kind of interpreting the news for the reader. And it's a choice you make. Do you want to, and you get to choose like what direction you want to push it in. So we're going to talk about responsibilities in a second.